So we are continuing our meandering through the book of Philippians, and today we are going to wrap up chapter 2, which brings us just about halfway through the book, and we are going to be on page 947 of the Bibles that you're handed on the way in. And if you don't have one, raise your hand. We got a couple of ushers that they are ready and willing and able to deliver a Bible straight to you. And so today, we are going to continue looking at this letter written by Paul. So in case you haven't been with us the entire time, just to give you a little background, Paul hated Christians for a long time. He was called Saul. You can read about that in Acts chapter 8. And I just laugh at the irony of this letter that the guy, without any sort of thought or consequence, he ripped people who followed the way from their homes. He persecuted them. He oversaw the stoning of one of the outspoken members of the church. And now he's in jail because he's proclaiming that same gospel. And I just wonder if at some point Paul just laughed at the irony of the situation that God had him in. So it was written from jail. We don't know if that was in Ephesus or Rome, and Kendall's mentioned all this, but I just want to make sure that we're all kind of starting in the same place. So last week, if you were here when I spoke about the passage right before we're going to be today, Paul started by telling the Philippians to stop complaining. Okay, that was not bringing glory to God. That was not allowing them to use their life as a contrast to the rest of the culture around them. Then he invited them to cling to the gospel. Whatever else the world is wanting you to do, cling to the gospel, the message of hope that we have. And then I ended with the question, what are you pouring yourself out for? What are you giving your energy and your sweat and maybe even your blood for? Is it the gospel or is it something for yourself? So we're going to continue on with what comes right after that. And Paul describes two of the people that he spends a great time with. In fact, he's going to give us a picture of two other people who are being poured out for the gospel of Christ and making sure that this message spreads throughout the region. And as we get going, when I began to think about what to say with this message, it made me wonder, what kind of relationships are we surrounding ourselves with? I don't know that this is something we too often think very intentionally about. What impact do those relationships have on us and the direction of our life and how we think about things? I lived for a time in Alabama. Missy and I, we moved there right out of college. It was the place that I got a job. We lived in the land of corn, cotton, and cows, really literally in the middle of nowhere. There was one stoplight. One of my favorite stories is that when the Burger King opened up there, they had to close down one lane of the highway because the drive-through wait was a mile long, okay? So this was a town that was desperate for outside things. When Missy and I would come back, our family would tell us that after living there for a year or so, we had started to drawl like a Southern, hey, y'all, and we denied it, because we couldn't hear it, but I guess to those around us, they could sense this. So us being immersed in this land where people speak differently, okay, cause us to start speaking differently. Also, a habit that I adopted there, because we lived in this small town, you'd be driving around and everybody would wave to you. Okay, it took me forever to get used to this, but after a while, you start passing, if you don't know them or not, you just wave, hey, how you doing, hand out the window, and it's just common occurrence, people being friendly. When we moved back to Florida, by the way, I kept this habit up for just a small amount of time, because when you wave at people in Florida, they think you're saying something else, okay? And I got all sorts of different waves that were not quite as polite back at me. So people that we are around, they influence us and what we do and our habits and our thinking. And so what can we see in the people that we've surrounded ourselves with? And so I'm just gonna start reading about what Paul talks about in these two men. Not page 947, as I mentioned. This is Philippians chapter 2. I'm gonna read verses 19 to 24 to start us off. And so Paul says, if the Lord Jesus is willing, I hope to send Timothy to you for a visit. Then he can cheer me up by telling me how you are getting along. I have no one else like Timothy who genuinely cares about your welfare. All the others care only for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. But you know how Timothy has proved himself. Like a son with his father, he has served with me in preaching the good news. I hope to send him to you just as soon as I find out what is going to happen to me here. And I have confidence from the Lord that I myself will come to see you soon. Here's the thing about Paul's writing. Most of Paul's writings, when he writes a letter, is like one long run-on sentence. It's stream of consciousness writing. And so if you think back a few weeks ago, we came to the end of chapter 1, and at the end of chapter 1, Paul says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. And then he uses that as a springboard to talk about, okay, what is this manner? What is the gospel? And we talk about the humility of Christ. And Kendall went through the prayer that forms the beginning segment of chapter 2. And then Paul talks about how he's being poured out and how he's living his life in a manner worthy of the gospel. And so out of nowhere, this is unlike most of his other letters. Since he's going through this, he gets to Timothy and the next person we're going to talk about, and he uses them as examples of people who are being poured out for the gospel as well. Most of the time when Paul starts talking about his upcoming plans and people he's going to send to a church, it's at the very end. But you can see Paul said, no time like the present to go ahead and throw this in, because it fits with the theme. So, stream of consciousness, he just starts talking about Timothy. Because Timothy is a picture of what it means to live a life worthy of the gospel that you've received. So, in case you don't know who Timothy is, Paul met Timothy when he was on one of his journeys, when he was in a town called Lystra. And in Acts chapter 16, you can see when Luke is recording this, that's when they meet. And the believers spoke well of Timothy to Paul. And so Paul said, well, maybe this is somebody that I want to have on my journey with me. And when I was reading this, the first thing that this caused me to think is the people who are around you, the people who are most influential in how you see the world and how you see yourself and how you see other people, what would the believers say of them? Would they speak well of these people that you have around you? Would they speak well of your relationships? Or are these relationships that you would rather hide and not have anybody in the church know that you are with them? Now, just as a timeout, I'm not saying that we should not have relationships with people outside the church. Okay, we definitely need to have relationships with people outside the church. Otherwise, how's the gospel going to spread? How are they going to see our light and our life and know that Jesus makes a difference? What I'm talking about here is relationships of influence. Okay, people that are going to impact your perceptions and your values and how you think. How would believers speak of those sorts of people in your lives? Paul judges, yes, this is somebody that the church speaks well of. This is somebody that I want to have with me, and he takes them, and they begin to journey together. We're told that the first thing he does with Timothy is he circumcises him, and then they leave. That's an interesting way to get to know somebody. So I don't recommend that is the thing that you do with somebody that you've just met and said, come into ministry. Thank you, Kendall, for not saying, hey, Scott, before you can speak at the church. Woo! I'm going to get off that topic before I get in some real trouble here. Sorry, ADD. So they begin to share in the work of the gospel, and Paul would leave Timothy in areas where he just planted a church. He trusted him so much and trusted him to continue the work so much that he left him on his own. And you can see that in what we just read in Philippians chapter 2. Paul says he's like a son with his father, right? When Paul writes a letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy, this is very beginning, Paul calls him his true son in the faith. This is somebody he's close with. Right? This is somebody that he's shared himself with. This is somebody that he wants to pass on his ministry to continue it. This is somebody that Paul sees himself in and has really invested his life in. So they've served together. And so now Paul is writing to the Philippians, and he wants to know what's going on with them. He started this church. He's got a lot invested in these believers in this particular area, and now he feels kind of strapped because he's in jail. He can't leave. He can't go find out what's going on. So he says, I really want to send Timothy to you. I want him to go to you to encourage you, and I want him to go so he can come back and encourage me about what's going on in the church down there. So because it's his true son in the faith, Timothy's the one that he appoints that he wants to send. But there's a problem. He can't send him at this moment. Paul's awaiting the verdict of his trial or whatever has gone on. Paul doesn't know if he's going to live or die at this moment. He doesn't know if he's going to get released and can continue to do the things that he was doing. He doesn't know if he's going to have to stay in jail for an extended period. He doesn't know if he's going to be beheaded because of what's going on. And so he says, I have no one like Timothy. And when you read the actual Greek words behind that statement, I have no one like Timothy, what Paul's saying is, me and Timothy, we are like-minded. Okay. We share the same direction. We share the same passions. We share the same motivation. And Paul says, I need to keep him around me. I need him to stay to encourage me as I'm going through this time where I don't know what's going to happen. Timothy is the representation of the faith that Paul is passing on, so he needs him to stay. Which brings up what I think is a second good question about the people we have around us. Who are you like-minded with? And those people that you are like-minded, what is it that you're like-minded about? Right? Are you like-minded for the gospel, or are you like-minded for something else? Now, I know we all go through seasons of life where we make friendships based on some activity that we're doing or some location that we tend to be, and that is great. So, a lot of the friends I had were in college were because I lived in the same dorm with them or I played a sport with them. But that's one season of life. What is your season of life telling you now about the people that you are with? This verse right here stuck out to me as I was reading Philippians chapter 2. When Paul's talking about how Timothy is like-minded with him, he says, all the others care only for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. Everybody else is looking out for their own interests rather than looking out for the interests of Jesus Christ. And when I read that, I want to believe, right? There's every part of me wants to believe that Paul is exhibiting a touch of exaggeration when he says this, right? Come on, Paul, like everybody doesn't care about Jesus. Everybody's looking for themselves. I want to believe that. But the more I think about it, I think there's more truth in his statement than I'm really comfortable admitting, especially in my own life. Right? We have this battle that we naturally settle into, right? This battle of our old nature that we were born with and that we lived with and that we got comfortable with, and then this new nature, this new coat that we put on when we begin to follow Christ. And it's so easy to fall back into those tendencies. Right, those tendencies that demand, I want to be affirmed, I want to be the center, I want more money, I want more recognition, and it's so easy. And it's so easy to put good words to these things. And I think that it's when we talk about what is consuming me, right? Am I self-absorbed or am I Christ-absorbed? So whose interests do you put on the front burner? How do you remind yourself what you are going to live for this day? Because if you're like me, which I don't know if you are, so I'm just going to reveal, I try to have it both ways a lot of times, right? I want credit for being a sincere, devoted Christ follower, but there's times that I just want to go have what I want the way I want it, right? I want to try to walk the fence. And if you've ever walked the fence in anything, you know that at some point you fall off, right? And hopefully, I want to fall off on the side of Jesus. A lot of our decisions, okay, are based on what's good for us, what's comfortable for us, what's convenient for us, what aligns with what we value and what's going to bring us some sort of accolades or glory. And that's why when we talk about discipleship, talk about this following Jesus on his path, we talk about emptying ourselves, right? When Jesus told the crowd what it meant to be his disciples, the first thing he said is, you need to deny yourself. And so we need to become empty of the values that we have and the way we see the world as right and wrong, and we need to become absorbed with Christ. When we are empty, we can become filled like a sponge. And that's why I think Paul, on his stream of consciousness, gets into this discussion of Timothy and the next guy we're going to see in a minute, because these are two men who are Christ-absorbed. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be absorbed with Christ? We can get a couple ideas here from looking at what Paul says about Timothy. The first thing is that looking out for the interests of Christ, or looking out for what matters to Christ, comes from one who is genuine. Okay, we're told that there's no one like Timothy because he genuinely cares about the welfare of the Philippian church. So all the while Paul is imprisoned, okay, we're reading this letter that Paul wrote from prison. So all the while Paul is in prison, he wants to keep pursuing his calling. Or he's not letting this obstacle that has been thrown in front of him stop him. I wonder, would I be like that? If I got thrown, if somebody came in right now and arrested me for what I'm telling you, would I from prison be so bent on communicating the gospel that I kept doing it at whatever the cost? Or would I get distracted, or would I get upset or bitter about my station? I mean, we don't even need to be arrested. Right? How often are we thinking about what maybe we're called to do or something we've committed to do, and it's too early or it's too hot, right? So we get distracted by these little things. But Paul is in jail. There is a genuineness. What comes out of you should be consistent with who you are on the inside and what matters most to you. And for Timothy, his genuine concern is for the Philippian church because he's like-minded with Paul. He has Christ on his mind at all time, and he proceeds in that direction. So the Philippians are on Paul's mind, and he wants to continue to guide their faith. And he's concerned about them. He wants them to stand firm in the midst of the persecution or the trials that they're going through that he's addressing. So Timothy being genuine here means that what is on the outside is consistent with what is on the inside. He's not fake. He's not wearing a fake garment. What's happening is coming from where he is rooted. We can look at an opposite example of this. We can use Christ's own words right here, looking at Matthew chapter 23. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus, he's going on this litany against the religious leaders and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and he's going thing after thing about them. He was really angry, upset, and calling them to task. And this is one of the things that he says. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. That's the picture of someone who is acting inconsistently. They want to be seen as holy and righteous, but the reason they're doing it is because they want power, or they want fame, or they want money or wealth or status. So their motivation is not the cause of God in this case. They looked one way, but they were really feeding something else. That's not genuineness. So Timothy being genuine means he has no ulterior motives. He's not looking to get anything from the Philippian church. He's not looking to get Paul's approval. He's doing it because this is what Christ has compelled him to do. He's not playing a part by trying to build an image of as a sincere follower. He's not seeking affirmation. And this is one of the things that I feel like we can see better in others than we can usually see it in ourselves. Right? We want to justify our behaviors and the way we act, and even if we're doing it with false motives, we can say, oh, well, look at the good result. Look at all the good that I'm doing. It doesn't really matter if it's based on a little bit of a lie. And so because of that, just again, looking at our relationships of influence, here's a question. How do we see this in the people that we surround ourselves with? What are we looking for? Well, our interests must be refined, right? If we're going to care about what matters to Christ, that is something that's going to be refined in your life. And so refining means it has to be tested. It has to be proven. And we see that in this Philippians passage. In verse 22, Paul says, but you know how Timothy has proved himself. Okay? He has gone through the tests, and he has proved that he is like-minded. He has proved where the root of his life is and what he is pursuing. Test it. You ever handed a $20 bill to a clerk at the convenience store when you're going to buy something? Do you ever notice what they do when you hand them a bill? The first thing they do, there's two tests that I've seen when I go to racetrack to buy drinks in the morning. Okay, which I do frequently, so I've seen this a lot, kind of an unhealthy habit. Takes the $20 bill, holds it up to the light. So there's something there that they're looking for. That's the first test. Okay, $20 bills are printed on special paper, as is all the money. Then, a lot of times, they will take something that looks like a highlighter, and they'll put it down on the counter, and they'll just draw a line. Because again, they're testing the paper, the little red and blue flecks that are in the paper. If it's not authentic, if that's not linen, okay, if that's not little bits of material, if it's counterfeited and those have been printed on there, they'll smudge. So that's the test to see if you have a genuine $20 bill. There was one time in my life this did not happen. I was snorkeling somewhere, and I found a $20 bill on the floor of the ocean. Yes, free money. So I held my breath, I went and grabbed it, put it in the pocket, it dried out, and me and Missy and Sarah, we were driving home from wherever we were, I don't remember, and we stopped in a convenience store. Apparently I live a lot of my life in convenience stores. And we stopped in one, and I handed the person behind the counter a $20 bill and paid and left, and we're driving out of the parking lot, and I look in the rearview mirror, and there is this man, looked like me, hadn't run that often in his entire life, but he was doing his best effort to catch up to me. So I stopped, and he bangs on the window. I'm like, what's going on? This $20 bill, it is no good. Give me another $20 bill. Okay, I didn't tell him I found that one on the floor of the ocean. Okay, he might have just, might have thumped me and asked for another $20 bill. I don't know, but it wasn't genuine. He had done the test, and he came out and gave me an account and he wanted a replacement. Timothy had been through the heat that accompanies a faith that's being lived in contrast to a culture that surrounds it. He had served together with Paul, and so Paul had seen this over and over. So here's another question about the relationships of influence that you have. How does your circle respond to trying circumstances? Do they respond with blame, or do they respond with humility? Do they take everything as part of the call to following Jesus? Or does it push them away from being faithful and walking the path that God has them on? Have they never experienced any sort of trial or pushback against their faith? That can tell you something else. What interests Timothy is Jesus and his kingdom. And in this case, the welfare of the Philippian church was what was interesting Jesus at that moment. We're going to continue reading Philippians chapter 2. We're going to look at the second person. So we've seen a little bit about Timothy, and now Paul continues on. He says, "Meanwhile, I thought I should send Epaphroditus back to you. He is a true brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, and he was your messenger to help me in my need. I am sending him because he has been longing to see you, and he was very distressed that you heard he was ill. And he certainly was ill. In fact, he almost died. But God had mercy on him and also on me, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. So I'm all the more anxious to send him back to you, for I know you will be glad to see him, and then I will not be so worried about you. Welcome him in the Lord's love and with great joy, and give him the honor that people like him deserve. For he risked his life for the work of Christ, and he was at the point of death while doing for me what you couldn't do from far away. By the way, just as an aside, when Kendall was doing the announcements and expressing the disappointment of not being able to go to Haiti, he said, we're still going to be faithful and we're going to send what we have there through a messenger and we're going to help the work. There's the biblical precedent for that. That's not any less of serving and doing what God has for us in the kingdom. It's doing what we are able to do from afar. Back on topic. Epaphroditus was part of the Philippian church. Some people think that he was one of its pastors, but we really don't know a whole lot about him except for this little paragraph that Paul says. But we do know that Epaphroditus, when there was an offering that needed to be made for Paul and his care while he was in prison, that Epaphroditus was the one that stepped up and said, I will deliver it. And more than that, by delivering it, he was committing to stay there during the tenure of Paul's time in prison to take care of his needs and go out and get the things that he needed and to communicate messages and do a lot of the errands. So whether it was in Rome or whether it was in Ephesus that Paul was imprisoned, this entailed hundreds of miles of walking, one way. A month or more's journey just to get and deliver this offering. And so we see that this didn't go well for Epaphroditus. When he was delivering this, when he arrived to see Paul, he was almost dead. Whatever he was suffering from, whether he got attacked or whether he got a virus, again, we don't know. But we know when he finally made it to Paul, it wasn't a very good situation. So when we're talking about being proven, and we're talking about the looking out for the interests of Jesus, a couple things that we can learn through Epaphroditus is that we have to remain resolute. Paul calls Epaphroditus a fellow soldier. As a fellow soldier, Epaphroditus was a man who would stand firm. Right? Wasn't going to back down from the onslaught and the attack. From the people that wanted to accuse Paul that he was in prison for doing something wrong rather than doing something right. He stood firm even though Paul wasn't getting all the crowds and the glory now. He stood by his side no matter what. We live in a world that's full of a lot of chaos and ugliness and injustice and busyness with other things and persecutions. And Epaphroditus was somebody that stood side by side no matter what. Do you have that in your life? Do you have somebody who's like-minded with you in pursuit of the gospel that will stand firm? Even when maybe you are persecuted or somebody spreads lies about you, is going to stand right there the whole time? Another thing we see through Epaphroditus is you have to have empathy. And I think a lot of times this is something that we lose in our media-driven culture. We become numb to all these things because all news seems to be bad news and anxiety-creating news. Paul says about Epaphroditus that he has been longing to see you, meaning his home church. And he was very distressed that they had heard he was ill. He didn't want them to worry or to fret or to have any anxiety about what was going on in his life. And so that was causing him to have a longing to see his people. Empathy is identifying with the needs of others. It's not overlooking those needs. It's not dismissing those needs. It is identifying with them. So rather than having an expectation of being served, rather than having a sense of entitlement, Epaphroditus was driven to empathy. We see this that he responded to Paul's need, walked the hundreds of miles to deliver it. We see this that he was concerned about the Philippians and wanted to get back to them. So, a question. How do you and those around you, how do you see people? Do you have what the Jewish culture would call the good eye? The eye that sees people and has compassion and wants to serve and wants to live in generosity and gratitude? Or do you see people as a way to get what you want, as a tool? Are people a burden, or are they an opportunity to serve? So the quality of how you see people is the result of where you're rooted. It all goes back to clinging to the gospel of hope that we have. Having compassion like Christ, that's derived from humility, not the desire to be served, but to serve others. Remembering that we were all lost at some point. And so instead of standing in judgment of people and the behaviors that they have that don't know Jesus, of saying, I want them to know the better way. Another thing we see from Epaphroditus is you have to accept as a follower of Christ, as somebody who's like-minded, that your life is not your own. We see a couple times here in this passage that Paul says he almost died and that he risked his life. And when Paul says he risked his life, what that means is that he did not regard his life as his own. He had the feeling that if he lost it, well, it was God's to take from him in the first place. So notice this. Being obedient, right? I'm assuming Epaphroditus knew that God wanted him to go on this journey and to deliver this offering. Being obedient does not mean easiness. I think that concept, we hear that all the time. Kendall says that over and over. But I think that every time we hear it, it kind of slaps us in the face because our culture, the culture that communicates to us and presses in on us, is a culture that is driven by ease and by leisure and by entertainment. So when we hear that being obedient is not going to make things easier or maybe make my life better in the physical now, that causes us to question things. Epaphroditus was being sent back by Paul before his job was even done. So now he was going to go back, he was going to return, and people were going to say, well, you weren't even strong enough to finish the job. But again, he's being obedient to do the thing that he is called to do, the thing that Paul's instructing him to do, because his life is not his own. One other thing that we can learn from Epaphroditus is that this life that is lived worthy of the gospel that has been proclaimed, when you live it, you are worthy of honor. Paul tells the Philippians, honor him, give him the honor that people like him deserve. Epaphroditus is living a life that, according to what it means to be in the kingdom. Don't tear him down because things didn't turn out the way you thought. Don't dismiss him because he's been gone for so long. Listen to people like this. Follow them. Serve with them. So again, I just want to take us back to the question that I led off with. What kind of relationships are you surrounded with? Here's a verse that I want you to reflect on as we are singing our last song and as we are preparing to give our offering in just a few minutes. This is Jesus in Luke chapter 14. And this is what he says about honoring certain people and the life lived in a like-minded pursuit of the gospel. He says, "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Paul and Timothy and Epaphroditus, they had put humility above all else. They had put obedience and emptying themselves and living a life worthy of the gospel as the number one aim in their life. They were willing to go up to even losing their own life in order to accomplish this, because what mattered more than anything was being with Jesus and living in proximity to him. So is that your concern? Is that the concern of the people that are guiding the way you think and the decisions that you make? Please pray with me. God, thank you so much that Paul brought these two men to our attention in his stream of consciousness letter. It's good to know and get encouragement from other people who have lived a life contrary to the culture and the values that culture supports in order to live for the cause of Jesus. And I pray, God, that all of us would take encouragement by that, and we would understand that we live in grace and that you are a God of second chances and spurring us on to love and good deeds. So I pray for all of us that as we leave here and we consider our lives and we consider our relationships, that you would bring to the forefront of our thinking maybe things that need to be changed or things that need to be encouraged so that we could have people around us that are going to help us live lives worthy of the gospel that we've received. Thank you every day for Jesus and what he did, and we love you this morning in his name. Amen. So my hope anytime that I speak is that there is something in what I said that you can latch onto and make a plan for a next step and how to better follow Jesus or be more obedient in some little way. So as you're thinking about your next steps, there's a couple ways that you can respond here this morning. We're going to have a couple people up at the front that would love to pray with you. So if there's anything going on in your lives, if there's any hurdle or obstacle to living a life worthy of the gospel, bring it up. Have a partner, somebody to walk with you in that. Also, that connection card you were given on the way in, if you need any information, if you want help with a next step or understanding something, or if you have a question, just jot that down on the connection card, and Kendall or somebody on the team will get in touch with you this week to help you take those next steps. We're going to close our service with a song, and after that, I hope you have an amazing week, and see you next Sunday.